By the time she realized her mistake, it was already too late. $180 million, gone in the time it took to say no to a handshake. He built his fortune from nothing. Today, he was about to save a company that didn't deserve him.
She looked at his hand recan and refused to take it. She had no idea who she was really talking to.
He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply toned and reached for his phone.
Freeze the wire transfer.
The handshake lasted less than 2 seconds. It was the kind of moment most people in that boardroom would forget. By lunchtime, a hand extended, a hand ignored, a flicker of awkwardness quickly swallowed by corporate politeness. But Marcus Bell would remember it for the rest of his life, and so would Diane Whitfield, though not for the reasons she expected. Before this story is over, you'll understand exactly how one refused handshake unraveled a $180 million deal, humbled a company that thought it was untouchable, and forced a woman who had spent her whole life looking down on people like Marcus to finally look at herself. If stories about quiet power, real consequences, and people who rise instead of rage speak to you, stay with this one until the end of Euro. And if you believe people like Marcus deserve to be seen, hit like and subscribe before we start, because there's a lot more of his story waiting for you. He's not born into money. He was born in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, the third of 4 children raised by a mother who worked double shifts as a hospital custodian, and a father who drove a delivery truck until his knees gave out. Marcus remembered nights when the refrigerator held nothing but condiments and hope, when his mother would tell him and his siblings that dinner was not that important tonight so they wouldn't notice she wasn't eating. He remembered being 12 years old and calculating, in his head, exactly how many days were left until his mother's paycheck, because he'd learned that knowing the number made the waiting easier. What Marcus also remembered what shaped him more than the hunger ever did was the quiet dignity his parents carried through all of it. His father never begged, never groveled, never let a bad day turn into a bad month. "You can be poor and still walk like a king," his father used to say, tapping 2 fingers against Marcus's chest. "Don't ever let a room decide what you're worth. You decide that before you walk in." Marcus carried those words like a second heartbeat. He got his first real break at 19, sweeping floors at a small investment firm downtown just to be near the energy of the place. He watched, he listened, he read every book on finance the local library had, then drove 40 minutes to a better library when he'd finished those. By 23, he wasn't sweeping floors anymore. He was managing a junior portfolio, quietly outperforming men twice his age who had degrees from schools Marcus could never have afforded. By 30, he'd started his own investment fund, Bell Capital Partners, built initially on his own modest savings and the trust of a handful of small business owners in his old neighborhood who remembered him as that Bell boy who always kept his word. By 45, Bell Capital Partners managed just over $2 billion in assets, specializing in what most big Wall Street firms considered too risky, too unglamorous, or too unconventional. Mid-sized manufacturing companies in economic distress, family businesses on the edge of collapse, and increasingly Euro companies willing to genuinely change how they operated in exchange for the capital that could save them. Marcus wasn't just an investor. He was, in his own quiet way, a second chance for companies that had run out of them. He was also a father. His wife, Renee, had passed away when their daughter Maya was 6, leaving Marcus to raise her largely on his own while building an empire during the day and reading bedtime stories at night. Maya was 11 years old now, sharp-tongued, curious, obsessed with space documentaries, and utterly unimpressed by her father's wealth. To Maya, Marcus wasn't a titan of finance. He was just Dad, the man who burned toast on Saturday mornings and always kept his promises. It was Maya, actually, who unknowingly set the stage for everything that would happen at Whitfield Global Manufacturing. A week before the fateful meeting, she'd asked her father a simple question over dinner. "Dad, if someone's mean to you, do you have to be nice back?" Marcus had thought about it for a long moment before answering. "No, baby, you don't have to be nice back, but you do have to stay who you are. Being cruel back doesn't punish them it just makes you smaller. The real punishment is when you stay exactly who you are, and they have to live with what they did." He didn't know it yet, but he was about to live out his own advice on a scale far bigger than a schoolyard disagreement. Whitfield Global Manufacturing had once been a titan of American industry, a euro, 3 generations of Whitfield's building precision machine parts that ended up in everything from farm equipment to aerospace components. But the last decade had not been kind. Overseas competition, an aging factory infrastructure, and 2 consecutive years of leadership turnover had left the company hemorrhaging cash and credibility. Diane Whitfield, the current CEO and granddaughter of the founder, had inherited a company in crisis and a board of directors running out of patience. Diane was 52, sharp, undeniably intelligent, and had clawed her way up through a company culture that had never made room for her easily. Either a euro, she'd fought her own battles as one of the only women in rooms full of men who doubted her. But somewhere along the way, the fight had hardened into something else, an armor of superiority that she wore without fully realizing it, a set of quiet assumptions about who belonged in the rooms she now controlled and who didn't. She had built walls to survive, and over time, those walls had started keeping the wrong people out. Whitfield Global needed $180 million to modernize its factories, pay down crushing debt, and avoid a bankruptcy filing that would cost nearly 4,000 employees their jobs. Every major bank had already passed. Every traditional lender had taken one look at Whitfield's balance sheet and walked away. There was exactly one serious offer left on the table, and it came from Bell Capital Partners. Marcus had spent 3 weeks with his team combing through Whitfield's books before deciding the company was worth the risk. Beneath the mismanagement, he saw good bones, a euro, skilled workers, salvageable equipment, a brand with real history. He saw a chance to save thousands of jobs and rebuild something meaningful, not just make a return. It was exactly the kind of deal Bell Capital had been built for. The final meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon on the 40th floor of Whitfield's headquarters, a euro. The meeting where the term sheet would be reviewed, questions answered, and hands shaken to signal the deal was, for all practical purposes, done. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, as he always did, dressed in his navy suit, carrying nothing but a slim leather folio and the quiet confidence of a man who had earned every square inch of the room he was about to enter. He was greeted warmly enough by the CFO and the general counsel, both of whom shook his hand firmly, thanked him for what this deal meant to the company, and made easy conversation about the weather and the view. Then Diane Whitfield walked in. She was polished, composed, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit that looked expensive even from across the room. She greeted her CFO with a nod, exchanged a professional word with her general counsel, and then her eyes landed on Marcus. There was the briefest pause, a euro, so brief most people in the room wouldn't have registered it, a euro, a half-second flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. Marcus extended his hand. "Ms. Whitfield, Marcus Bell, it's good to finally meet you in person." Diane's eyes dropped to his outstretched hand, and then, instead of taking it, she gave a tight, closed-lipped smile, offered a small nod, and said, "Let's just get started, shall we? I have another call after this." She turned and walked toward the head of the table, leaving Marcus's hand hanging in the air for a moment that felt, to everyone watching, uncomfortably long. The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone has noticed something but no one is willing to say it out loud. The CFO shifted in his seat. The general counsel suddenly found something fascinating to look at on his legal pad. Marcus slowly lowered his hand, and if anyone expected an outburst, a raised voice, an accusation, a euro, they didn't get one. Marcus simply nodded once, said, "Of course," and took his seat at the table as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But something had happened, and everyone in that room, including Diane, knew exactly what it was. The meeting proceeded on the surface as though nothing was wrong. Numbers were reviewed, terms were discussed. Diane asked sharp, capable questions about covenants and repayment structures, and Marcus answered every one of them with the same calm precision he brought to everything. To an outside observer, it might have looked like business as usual, but Marcus noticed every small thing, a euro, the way Diane addressed her comments to his younger white associate, David, instead of to him, even when Marcus was the one who'd built the fund and made the final decisions. The way she referred to your firm as though Marcus were merely representing someone else's money instead of his own. The way, when Marcus offered a particularly incisive point about restructuring their supply chain, she paused just a beat too long before saying, "That's surprisingly thorough." as if thoroughness were the last thing she expected from him. None of it was loud. None of it would show up cleanly in a transcript. But Marcus had spent 45 years learning to read rooms exactly like this one, and he knew precisely what he was looking at. He said nothing. He finished the meeting with the same professionalism he'd started it with, shook hands with the CFO and general counsel on his way out, firm, warm handshakes, both of them €, and walked toward the elevator without a single word of complaint. It was in the elevator, alone, watching the floor numbers tick downward, that Marcus made his decision. He pulled out his phone and called his managing partner, Elena Reyes. "Elena, it's Marcus. I need you to pause the Whitfield wire before it goes out tomorrow morning." "Pause it?" "Marcus, we finalized everything. The board approved it last week. What happened?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking at his own reflection in the elevator's polished doors. "I'll explain everything when I'm back at the office. For now, freeze the transfer. Nothing moves until I say so." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hand on anything. He simply made the call, calmly and completely, the way he made every important decision in his life, €. And then he stepped out of the building into the late afternoon sun, got into his car, and went home to have dinner with his daughter, who wanted to talk about a documentary on black holes she'd watched that morning. The fallout began the very next day, though not in the way anyone at Whitfield Global expected. When the wire transfer failed to arrive, the CFO called Bell Capital Partners' offices in a mild panic, assuming a clerical error. Elena Reyes, calm and professional as always, informed him that Mr. Bell had decided to place the deal under review and would follow up with formal communication within the week. No further details were given. Panic at Whitfield Global escalated quickly once the board of directors learned what had happened. Without Bell Capital's $180 million, the company had roughly 6 weeks of runway before it would be forced to file for bankruptcy protection, a filing that would trigger immediate layoffs across all 3 of its remaining factories. Board members who had spent months quietly reassuring themselves that this deal was a formality now found themselves making frantic calls, trying to understand exactly what had gone wrong. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. The general counsel, a man named Robert Finch who had sat in that boardroom and watched the entire handshake incident unfold, was the one who finally said it plainly to the board. Diane refused to shake his hand in front of the entire room. "I watched it happen. I think that's what this is about." The reaction inside the boardroom was immediate and severe. Board members who had spent a decade indulging Diane's difficult moods because of the family name attached to her now found themselves facing an existential threat to the company because of one unguarded, ugly instant. Whitfield Global's largest institutional shareholder, a pension fund with a well-publicized commitment to corporate accountability, began asking pointed questions. A junior associate who had been in the room, €, sworn to confidentiality about internal matters but apparently not immune to conscience, described the incident without naming names directly in a comment on an industry forum discussing the sudden stalling of a major manufacturing rescue deal. Within 72 hours, a financial journalist had connected the dots, and the story broke publicly. Whitfield Global's CEO had allegedly snubbed a black investor whose firm was the company's last remaining lifeline, and that investor had, in response, frozen the deal that stood between the company and collapse. The headlines were brutal. Business commentators who had spent years praising Whitfield Global's storied legacy now dissected the incident on television panels and financial podcasts. Some defended Diane, insisting the story was being exaggerated or taken out of context. Others were far less forgiving, pointing to a pattern of complaints from former employees about Diane's leadership style that had never previously gained traction. Whitfield Global's stock, already fragile, dropped another 11% in 2 days of trading. Employees at the company's 3 factories, welders, machinists, quality inspectors, people who had nothing to do with the boardroom and everything to lose because of it, began quietly updating their resumes, terrified their jobs were now hanging by an even thinner thread. Diane Whitfield, for the first time in her career, found herself completely unable to control the narrative around her. She had weathered difficult press before a factory accident 5 years earlier, a messy union negotiation the year before that a euro. But she had always managed to project competence, composure, control. This was different. This wasn't a strategic misstep or a market downturn she could explain away with charts and quarterly projections. This was about who she was, laid bare in front of the entire industry, and there was no spreadsheet that could fix it. She spent that week largely alone in her office, replaying the moment in her mind over and over. She told herself at first that she had simply been rushed, distracted, thinking about the call she had afterward a euro, that it wasn't about Marcus at all. But the more she turned it over, the more she couldn't escape a memory she'd buried for decades. Her father, the company's former chairman, standing in that same building years ago, telling a young Diane, freshly promoted, that she needed to watch which men she let get too comfortable in this building. He'd never explained exactly what he meant. He hadn't needed to. Diane had absorbed the lesson the way children absorb things they're too young to question a euro, not as an instruction, but as the shape of the world itself. And somewhere in the years since, without ever consciously deciding to believe it, some quiet, ugly version of that lesson had taken root in her and never fully left. It was her CFO, of all people, who finally said the thing no one else on her team had the courage to say. He came to her office on the Thursday of that terrible week, closed the door, and said simply, "Diane, I don't think you meant to hurt anyone that day, but I watched you do it, and if you don't own that, honestly, completely, we are not going to survive this error. Not the deal, not the company, and maybe not your career either." Diane sat with that for a long time after he left. She thought about the 4,000 employees whose jobs hung in the balance because of a 2-second decision she'd made without even fully registering she was making it. She thought about her grandfather, who had built this company on the belief that a person's word and work were what mattered, not who they were born as a euro, a belief the company, and apparently Diane herself, had drifted quietly away from over the decades. And she thought, finally, honestly, about Marcus Bell's outstretched hand, hanging in the air, and the look on his face, euro, not anger, not even surprise, just a kind of tired, familiar patience, as though this were a moment he had lived through more times than he could count. The following Monday, without informing her board, without a publicist, without a prepared statement, Diane Whitfield drove to Bell Capital Partners' offices and asked to see Marcus Bell in person. Marcus's assistant informed him of the unscheduled visitor, and for a moment, Marcus considered declining the meeting entirely. But his father's voice echoed in his memory. "A euro. You decide what you're worth before you walk into the room. A euro." And Marcus realized that turning her away wouldn't be strength. It would just be a different kind of smallness. He agreed to see her. Diane walked into his office looking, for the first time since Marcus had met her, genuinely uncertain. She didn't sit down until he offered her the chair, and when she finally spoke, there was none of the polish from the boardroom in her voice. "I came to apologize," she said. "Not because my board told me to, not because of the press. I've spent a week trying to find a way to explain what I did that Tuesday, and I can't, because there isn't one. I didn't shake your hand because some old, ugly part of me decided in half a second that you didn't deserve the same respect I gave every other person in that room. I've spent my whole career fighting for a seat at tables that didn't want me there, and somehow, without ever meaning to, I built my own version of the exact same wall that was built against me. I'm ashamed of that, and I'm sorry." Marcus listened without interrupting, the same calm expression he'd worn in the elevator a week earlier settling over his face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I appreciate you coming here and saying that to my face," he said finally. "That took more than most people manage. But I need you to understand something, Ms. Whitfield. I didn't freeze that deal to punish you. I froze it because I needed to know whether the company I was about to invest $180 million in was actually capable of change, or whether it was just going to keep being what it's always been, dressed up in new paperwork. Your apology answers part of that question. What you do next answers the rest." Diane nodded, steadying herself. "Then tell me what next needs to look like." What came out of that conversation over the following weeks was not simply a reinstated deal a euro. It was a fundamentally renegotiated one. Marcus agreed to move forward with the $180 million investment, but on new terms he and his team drafted personally. An independent oversight committee with real authority, a formal leadership accountability framework, and a company-wide initiative €1 funded separately by Bell Capital €1 to create mentorship and advancement pathways for employees who had historically been overlooked for leadership roles within Whitfield Global. Diane didn't fight any of it. If anything, she pushed her own board to accept terms even stricter than what Marcus proposed, as if determined to prove, through action rather than apology, that something in her had actually shifted. The deal closed 6 weeks later than originally planned, but it closed. Whitfield Global's factories stayed open. 4,000 jobs were saved. And the story that reporters had first covered as a scandal slowly became something else entirely, a case study, discussed in business schools and leadership seminars, about accountability, about the cost of quiet prejudice, and about what real change actually requires. Not a statement, not a headline, but the harder, slower work of rebuilding trust through action. Marcus never sought credit for any of it publicly. When journalists reached out asking him to comment on the incident that had briefly made him a minor public figure, he gave the same short answer every time: "I don't need anyone to lose for me to win. I just needed to know I was investing in something built on solid ground. Now I believe I am." He went home most evenings the same way he always had. Ate dinner with Maya, listened to her explain the life cycle of stars with the intensity of a professor twice her age, and tucked her into bed with the same quiet gratitude he'd carried since the day she was born. One evening, months later, Maya asked him about the story she'd overheard her father mention on a phone call €1, the CEO, the handshake, the frozen deal. "Dad, were you ever going to just let the company fail because of what she did?" Marcus considered the question carefully, the way he considered everything. "No, baby. I was never trying to destroy anything. I just needed her €1 and everybody in that building €1 to understand that respect isn't optional, and it isn't something you get to hand out selectively based on how a person looks. That's the whole lesson, not revenge, just a line. Everybody needs to know where the line is." Maya thought about that for a moment, then nodded seriously, the way only an 11-year-old fully committed to a new piece of wisdom can nod. "So you didn't get mad. You just made her understand the line." "That's exactly right," Marcus said, smoothing the blanket over her shoulders. "Anger burns fast and leaves nothing behind but ash. But when you hold your ground calmly, when you stay exactly who you are no matter how someone treats you, that's the kind of fire that actually changes something. That's the kind that lasts." Whitfield Global Manufacturing survived, rebuilt, and within 2 years posted its first profitable quarter in nearly a decade. Diane Whitfield remained CEO, but colleagues who worked with her afterward often remarked that something about her had fundamentally shifted €1. She was slower to judge, quicker to listen, and visibly, deliberately intentional about the way she treated everyone who walked into her boardroom, regardless of what chair they sat in or what neighborhood they'd come from. She never forgot the lesson of that Tuesday afternoon, and to her credit, she never tried to. And Marcus Bell went on exactly as he always had, €1 building, investing, mentoring, raising his daughter, and quietly proving, deal after deal, year after year, that the measure of a man was never in the room he was allowed into, but in how he carried himself once he was there. He never raised his voice that day. He never needed to. He simply stayed who he was, €1, and let the world catch up to what that was worth. If this story moved you even a little, that's exactly why stories like this matter, €1, because dignity, when it's held with patience instead of anger, has a way of outlasting every wall built against it. If you want more stories like Marcus's, make sure you're subscribed, drop a comment telling us what part hit you hardest, and we'll see you in the next one.